Dr. Chee Soon Juan, welcome to Malaysiakini, and thanks for joining us today for this interview.
Thanks, good to be here.
It's great to have you here in Malaysia. On this occasion, we know you're a very important spokesperson on affairs in Singapore, being a politician and the Secretary General of the Singapore Democratic Party. Singapore will be celebrating its 50th anniversary as a nation in a few months. The world sees Singapore as a great success story, but you are a well-known critique of the government of current affairs in Singapore. How do you see the next few years and shaping up for Singapore?
I worry that we've been just living off these headlines, looking at Singapore in terms of its economic development. Behind the scenes, behind the headlines, you have a situation where economic disparity, income inequality is one of the highest in the industrialized world. You have no minimum wage. You have the middle class households living from paycheck to paycheck. We still don't have universal health care. And all these things add up into making the outlook of Singapore very questionable. And so people are struggling. Singaporeans are struggling. And it's hugely important that we have this a proper conversation going forward, where the people are more involved in the public process. That's still not coming around, and we're still seeing a very autocratic system in place.
We're in Southeast Asia, and Singapore is, despite what you say, Singapore is still seen as a success story. People are envious. Malaysians are envious of Singaporeans, and they want to go there and work in Singapore. But you're saying there's huge disparities, right? Is that how is that reflected in the daily lives of Singaporeans? Tell us what's the life of the middle class. What are their anxieties?
I think one of the biggest problems is that Singapore has not graduated to the next level of our economic development. We still are very dependent on attracting multinational corporations coming in, and that's been the model for the past half a century. But because you don't have a system where there is an openness, where people come together and are able to be creative, innovation is still very elusive in Singapore. And so we're not able to actually be able to regenerate our economy. And because we're still so dependent on these multinationals, we've had to keep wages down, because that's big business cost for these companies. When you have to do that in order to attract these MNCs, the natural tendency then is for us to look to the neighboring countries to bring in some of this cheap foreign labor to be able to continue to remain attractive to these multinationals. But when they come in, these foreign workers come in, they place a very intense downward pressure on wages on Singaporeans, on the locals. So the people now find themselves having to compete with some of these foreign workers, and the immigration policy has been so lax that today nearly 40% of the population in Singapore are non-Singaporean. That creates a huge amount of unhappiness, social, economic dislocation for the people. And so, these are issues that we need to grapple with as we go forward.
Some would argue that, with any open economy, you bring in capital, you bring in talent, and that Singaporeans just have to compete, right? This is the reality of the open, an open world, a globalized world, right? People may see Singaporeans as, complaining too much.
Sure.
How do you respond?
I don't think Singaporeans have any problems when it comes to competition. I think given fair shake, Singaporeans are able to compete with the best in the world. The only problem is that right now Singaporeans are not allowed to compete, meaning that the government has always been ensuring that there is no freedoms, fundamental freedoms here, so much so that then workers cannot freely organize themselves. We still don't have independent trade unions, and the labor laws are so weak at this point that they are placed at a disadvantage. So When it comes to competition, there's not a problem with Singaporeans being able to hold our own. But it's just through these years of making sure that Singaporeans are just seen and not heard. That's the problem. And I think into the future, we're going to see that those kinds of problems coming around and bite us even harder.
So what does SDP advocate? We understand the next elections are around the corner, next year, maybe even this year. What is the SDP calling for?
We've always said that without political rights, you cannot have economic rights. And I've said this for years, and it's coming around and proving itself to be true. When you look at us being able, for example, to compete, again, Singaporeans know that we need to open up our economy to have this influx of foreign talent. But that's where that quality of foreign workers coming to Singapore matter a lot. And right now we're seeing, as we speak, there's this issue of foreigners, coming with fake degrees and so on and so forth. That's a huge concern. And when the floodgates are open up indiscriminately, I think that's where Singaporeans are very concerned about.
Are you saying that we should close the floodgates? We should have less foreigners working?
No. As I said, instinctively, Singaporeans know that we need. We're a nation of immigrants anyway. And I think what we understand is that with infusion of talent, that's going to be important. The problem with this government right now is that because of this autocratic nature, a lot of Singaporeans are leaving the country. And because of the high cost of living, we're just the most expensive city in the world. Younger Singaporeans don't want, feeling hesitant, wanting to reproduce, younger Singaporeans, right? And at 1.2 births per woman, we are the least fertile country in the world as far as reproduction is concerned. Given that situation right now, we have our population is not replacing itself, and the government thinks that, well, okay, what's the next solution? Instead of really looking at the root cause of the problem, they bring in foreigners, right, just to expand, keep up the population rate. But the infrastructure is not keeping up. So all this adds in to the morass of problems, and then you find Singaporeans become very unhappy, workers then become very unproductive. Across Asia, we have the unhappiest, most dissatisfied workers. And all this feeds into productivity levels. And then so you have this vicious cycle going on, and there's all these interlinked, interdependent problems that we're not able to sort out.
Right. You call for more freedoms, more political freedoms, right? Can you give us a few examples of what would be some of the critical changes that SDP would be calling for in terms of these freedoms?
The one, I think, very important area that we have to look at is to ensure that the media doesn't remain in the hands of the government. You're
talking about traditional media?
Yes, we're talking about, I'm referring to the traditional media. For somebody like me, for example, grew up knowing one TV station, hearing one radio station, reading one newspaper, all essentially controlled by the government. At some point, this has got to change. We have the internet right now, the new media coming in, but there's still a large segment of Singaporeans that still depend on the traditional media for its news. And then you have also the areas of your fundamental freedoms, as I said, the freedoms of speech, of association, of assembly. That is still very much curtailed in Singapore. And all this adds in to this problem whereby, again, without these freedoms, you cannot create the society that we call having a buzz. And that translates into creativity and spontaneity and innovation and risk-taking. And all this adds into an economy that's unable to regenerate itself and graduate to the next level.
Do you think Singaporeans really agree with you? I mean, again, many people will say that perhaps these freedoms are not so important. Perhaps we can be entrepreneurs and innovative,
sure,
without these political freedoms. There's a lot of freedom on the internet. We can read, just about any news that we want. some may argue that these are actually not necessary.
Yeah. Well, that's where the chicken or the egg comes first, right? You have the situation where Singaporeans still are not able to have this conversation. I'm having this conversation here online, but in my more than 20 years of political involvement, I've not had an opportunity to get onto the TV station, to have this discussion, to have this debate about where we find ourselves and where we're headed. And so I keep saying, what is the government afraid of? What is the government afraid of in terms of an open discussion where we have this contest of ideas and put it before the people? If you think that Singaporeans are really are not concerned about the political freedoms, then then how do you begin to assess this when you keep curtailing their rights to having a free media? So this is, I think, an area that we have got to grapple with.
So, Soon Juan, what's your message to Singaporeans as they celebrate the 50th anniversary of Singapore this August?
Yeah, I think we have something to be very proud about, looking at what we've managed to achieve in the last half a century. But what I think we must be careful is to ensure that we're not complacent and think that what has worked in the past will continue to work for us in the future. That is going to be disastrous. And so, you know, even as we celebrate our 50th anniversary as an independent nation, we have to be very mindful that we need a strong opposition in Parliament to ensure that all the gains that were made right now are just not thrown away. And if you look at the situation, these younger ministers that have taken over, I think because they've been cultivated through an elite system, they know very little about the daily hardships, the difficulties, the worries, the concerns of the average people. The only way that we're going to get them to be more responsive to our needs, our interests, our aspirations, is to get an opposition into Parliament, an opposition that understands their language and that has been around with them and grown up together with them. That, I think, is immensely important. And so if Singaporeans are going to continue to want to not just survive but continue to prosper, I think we cannot but have a more democratic system, and that means having an effective opposition in Parliament.
So basically the contestation of these two political forces is very important in order not to allow the country to slide into complacency and resting on its laurels in the last 50 years instead of looking forward to the challenges ahead.
Yes, and I think you know, if you know, when you talk to Singaporeans, we're very concerned about our economic well-being. As far as we have come, we're still. But beyond that, we've also got to look at more the intangibles, and I think Singaporeans are beginning to grasp that idea. With the influx of foreigners, the almost unbridled influx of foreigners, we've begun to ask questions. Who is a Singaporean? What is a Singaporean? And I think that all comes into play right now as we begin to mature and we talk about nationhood, who we are as a people, what we want to see. You look at the Singaporean males. When we turn 18, we have to serve our national service. And then they go into to serve national service and they ask, what are we defending? Who are we defending? These are the questions that Singaporeans are beginning to ask right now, and I think that's a healthy sign of our development. But again, all this can only come about if we have a more open, more democratic system where we can hold the government accountable.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chee Soon Juan.
Thank you.